Thanks, Stephanie. And I'm going to ask if you can unmute Sue Carson so Sue can give us an update on Conservation Authority Watch, one of the programs that we run.
Okay, I'm on now. A little over 2 years ago, a small number of us on Hamilton 350 formed this subgroup called Conservation Matters. We decided that conservation authorities were coming under attack from the Ford government, and it would be sensible to find out how they were responding to pressure. Since then, one or two of our committee have watched every monthly board meeting for the 5 local conservation authorities. The advent of Bill 23 has been even more devastating for the conservation authorities, and listening to their board discussions, we have understood the frustration of board members. Hamilton Conservation is in the process of actually creating a new wetland to save Lower Stony Creek from flooding, whereas Mr. Ford's development cronies are buying up wetlands in order to build homes and warehouses. Tonight's presentation will show you the value of wetlands. If you feel compelled to help, we could really do with more volunteers to help us follow the Conservation Authority meetings on Zoom. It's only about 2 hours a month that's needed. If you'd like to help, I'll put my email in the chat, or you can contact me through the chat tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sue. And we will also make sure that your contact information goes out to everyone who's attended and registered for tonight so that you can view this video, which, as you noticed, has been recorded, and you can get other information, because we won't be able to grab everything off the screen that you will hopefully want to have before the end of this webinar. So I want to turn to David Mivasar to talk a bit about the efforts underway to protect the Greenbelt and the lands that have been forced into the urban boundary in Hamilton. David, can you, can we unmute you? I think, there you are. Good.
I got it. Thank you. So just in light of what Don just said about it, the attempts to destroy the Gardner Marsh and what we just heard about conservation authorities, a lot of us have no faith whatsoever that the mechanisms that are in place to protect the land are going to be able to stop what the people with the money are trying to do. So we are organizing ourselves into teams that are local teams in different places across southern Ontario to first monitor the land, to scout it out, to watch what's going on. And second, to organize and prepare ourselves to take nonviolent direct action if that becomes necessary, and to actually go out on the land and physically directly protect it. And I'd like to tell everyone how to sign up for that. I don't know if you want to talk about that more right now, or give me just a sec.
You can put that into.
I got what I need. I'm going to post into the.
David, I put the Guardians.com website in there.
Good. Okay. I just did that again. Okay. So I know what I said was very sketchy and vague, but I'll add that there's a very active group in Hamilton. Hamilton may have the most active group across the whole province. And we are actively scouting, monitoring, surveilling what's going on, and also kind of forming a team that, if it becomes necessary, we'll be prepared to directly, physically intervene. And Mary's a part of it, and I'm a part of it, and there's others who have been in the background. But I just want to invite everyone, if you're interested, to sign up at that Greenbelt Guardian website. There's a thing to click on that says something like sign up to scout the land. And that's just it's the publicly facing language that we're using. We're scouting the land, but we all know what we mean.
Yeah, and could I just add, David, if you're interested in doing stuff like media or, helping us to do rallies when that seems appropriate, just sign up there, and then we can, help you get to the right group to be with.
Yeah, just another kind of need that we have is for research. For example, researching the kinds of species that live in these places. Are they Are they protected species? Can we leverage the government to do something about that? Researching archaeological remains of First Nations. Similarly, the government would step in and protect more if we knew that that was there. So I'm just making a point that if you're not like up for like running out in a field and stopping a bulldozer, there's still plenty of other ways that you can contribute to the overall effort. And signing up at that website is one way to get connected into that whole realm of activity.
Thank you very much, David. And as I said, that information is sent in the chat, and it will also be included in the package that we email out to you tomorrow or the next day after this webinar is over. So I want to go on to what will be a centerpiece of what we're talking about tonight. I've got a set of slides that I'm hoping that I can share. And there they are. No, well, go. So first off, just as a reminder, we've been doing webinars like this for some time. We may not be as good at it tonight as we have been earlier. This is our 11th webinar and the beginning of our 3rd year of doing webinars on conservation matters. What's happened to set us back a little bit perhaps, or disable us somewhat, is the city of Hamilton has come in and grabbed some of our best people. Alex Wilson used to be the main host of this. Alex Wilson is now a city councillor. Craig Kassar did a lot of the work on this, and Craig Kassar is now a city councillor. And that's not a bad thing, obviously, but it does add to the challenges of working our way through this process. So I want to talk about the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. I'm hoping you can all see that screen. This is a system that was originally designed in 1980 as a joint federal and provincial project to score the values of wetlands and to set up ways in which we can ensure that the wetlands, especially those that are most valuable, are protected, because we've lost a great percentage of the wetlands in Ontario, certainly over 70% in Southern Ontario. The key outcome for this Ontario Wetland Evaluation System was the identification of provincially significant wetlands, which you probably heard reference to. Cootes Paradise, for example, is a provincially significant wetland. So is Beverly Swamp. And they have legislated protection, particularly through the efforts of the conservation authorities. So this Ontario Wetland Evaluation System has now been changed. It was changed as part of a what I would call a perfect storm of assault by the provincial government, particularly aimed at conservation authorities and municipalities. So the municipal elections, you will remember, were back on October 24th. The next day, Bill 23, which many of you probably have been demonstrating against and writing letters on and so on, it was introduced and unveiled the day after the elections. On that same day, the changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System were also posted. And by the end of the week, we discovered that the provincial government had torn apart the new official plan of Hamilton, the new official plan of Halton and other municipalities, and forced large urban boundary expansions, which had been specifically rejected in Hamilton and Halton. And even in other places, the amount that had been approved was increased. So that all happened in the first week. The next week, beginning of the next week, the provincial government announced it was taking 7,400 acres out of the Greenbelt, which it had promised never to do, repeated the promises over and over again, but that was the announcement on November 4th. All of this took place before new councils were sworn in on November 15th. So it was all in a period of time in which there was very little opportunity for cities, municipalities, city councils to respond to this because they weren't functioning. The old councils largely disappeared at the time of the municipal elections, and the new councils were not sworn in until the 15th of November. So this is the context in which this changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System were conducted. The major changes are as follows. The idea of a wetland or the category of wetland complexes has been removed from the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. Wetland complexes are the largest usually and quite often provincially significant, and they are recognizing that even though a pond may be 50 meters away from another pond, they're intricately connected. And we'll get some more description of wetland complexes later in our webinar. Endangered species were one of the main ways in which an area was identified as particularly significant, scored higher. They no longer count. The conservation authorities were given oversight over any wetland evaluations that took place. So if you did a wetland evaluation, you had to then go to the conservation authority and ask them to review it and vet it and consider if it's accurate or not and provide you with additional information. And the conservation authorities were also in a position of being the permitter for changes to the landscape, including wetlands, and that permitting requirement was removed by Bill 23. So it's not removed here, it's removed as part of the Bill 23 at the same time. The Provincial Ministry of the Environment or the Ministry of Natural Resources were also given oversight for any wetland evaluations. So if you did a wetland evaluation, you had to go to the ministry and get their approval and get their review and oversight. That's been removed. Wetlands that were not identified as provincially significant were generally classified as locally significant wetlands. That category is no longer part of the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. So now what we've got is oversight is limited to municipalities who don't have any expertise to actually review evaluations. So the way this will unfold now is a developer who wants to, or a landowner who wants to make changes to a wetland, fill it in, build over it, whatever, or build beside it, will hire someone, a consultant, to do an evaluation. That evaluation won't go to the Conservation Authority. It won't go to the provincial ministry. It will only be handed in as part of the development application to the municipality. And so the oversight is now limited to a part of our government system that doesn't have any experience doing this and any expertise on staff to do it. So really it puts the evaluation of wetlands, including the wetlands that are already there and have been evaluated previously, can now be reevaluated by a consultant working for a landowner or developer, and that will allow them to advocate for or justify or argue to justify that the wetland is not important, it can be filled in, and so on. So those are the major changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, and that's a big problem, and it's one that hasn't had a huge amount of attention because there's been so many things that the provincial government has done in the last 3 months. So we are arguing tonight that there is a way in which we can actually challenge this. And that is to call on the federal government to intervene to protect and ensure that we get proper evaluation of wetlands and proper protection of wetlands. And there's a number of reasons why that federal action is reasonable and justified. The first of all is, as I mentioned, this wetland evaluation system was initially a joint federal Ontario project. So the federal government was there at its birth and part of the creation of this system. And that was partly because the federal government has a lot of direct responsibilities for things connected to wetlands, particularly endangered species and fish habitat, both of which are under the federal jurisdiction, not the provincial jurisdiction. Although there's provincial endangered species legislation as well, the federal government is the main head of power on that. Indigenous rights and reconciliation also fall primarily to federal authority. The impact on these lands and waters is certainly something that is impacting the obligations that we have and the long-term protection of lands and waters by our Indigenous friends. In addition, the federal government it's now been established that they are the lead agency on climate action. And climate action, you'll remember that the provincial government in Ontario and a couple of other provincial governments went to court saying the federal government cannot establish a carbon fee. They lost. The federal government won that case, and the federal government is in charge of the issues of addressing climate action. And wetlands in particular are really central to the question of climate change. And we'll hear more about that as we go along in this webinar. I also mentioned their COP15. COP15 is the conference that was held recently in Montreal, an international conference on biodiversity, and which came up with a biodiversity decision, an agreement, which is called, dubbed 30 by 30, protecting 30% of biodiversity of the lands and waters that provide biodiversity by 2030. So the federal government, Canadian government has signed on to this, has made a promise that that's what's going to happen in Canada. So anything that is deteriorating and degrading habitat and degrading biodiversity, which any attack on wetlands will do, is a federal matter, and the federal government has oversight of that. In addition, we've seen lots of effects of climate change already, including the Hurricane Fiona in the Maritimes, flooding in Calgary in 2014, in Toronto in 2016, in Burlington, and very often it's the federal government that gets asked to do the bailouts and financial assistance when these disasters take place. So flooding and extreme weather bailouts are also federal matters. Wetlands are one of the key ways, the natural ways in which we prevent flooding. Wetlands act as sponges. They act as holding areas for water so that it doesn't end up in your basement or on your street or flooding your community. So on the basis of these kinds of clear federal responsibilities, we are urging you and everyone that we're reaching out to contact federal MPs and also to contact the conservation authorities, to urge them to contact the federal government and ask them to intervene to ensure that the damage that is being imposed by the changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System is reversed and managed in terms of the federal reasons why they need to be there. So we'll be providing you with a list of federal MPs in the area. We'll provide you with a list, email list for local conservation authorities so that you can write to the Conservation Authority Board, and it will be circulated to the board members, urging them that this is something that they should be taking steps on, making appeals directly to the federal government to intervene. And we know in terms of the Bill 23 and some of the other things which have been done with respect to the provincial government's actions threatening our natural features, that the federal government has already indicated some significant interest in this, both in terms of the impacts on parks and also the impacts on climate objectives of the federal government. The federal minister of the environment, Stephen Guilbeault, has spoken out on this, but so far we haven't seen specific action. And we need specific action. Words are nice, but we actually need to have some real intervention by the federal government to counter the kinds of things that have happened here in Ontario, because lots of us have been out there demonstrating and writing letters and sending emails and making phone calls and so on. And we've discovered maybe not discovered, maybe just rediscovered, that our provincial government is not listening and is not responding to these things. So we need other ways of approaching this. So I just want to throw up a couple of maps here that gives you some sense of why there's a bigger threat right now to wetlands in Hamilton and the Hamilton area. This shows the area of Hamilton and Ancaster, between Garner Road and up towards Butter Road, between Shaver and Fiddler's Green, that has been removed from the Greenbelt by the provincial government. And there's lots of evidence in there just from this mapping that there's wetlands in there. There's lots of areas that may be now subject to development pressures and development applications. The Greenbelt Guardians, of course, are paying attention to this area and a number of others. This is 1,100 acre property of the wetland, of the Greenbelt removals in Hamilton. This is by far the largest piece. Garner Marsh, we've talked a bit about it. It is over on the right-hand side. It's not blued out here. It's close to Highway 6, but it also is going to be increasingly affected by these kinds of changes. This is an area up along 20 Road, which has been now added to the urban boundary by the provincial fiat. And it again is an area with lots of upper areas for 20 Mile Creek and the wetlands and wet areas that are associated with that. So these are just some of the examples of the lands that are being threatened directly, and why it's so important for us to intervene and act on the changes that have been conducted here. And I'm going to stop sharing. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to Sophia Wilkinson, who is going to manage the rest of this webinar pretty much, and introduce and provide herself some of the expertise. Sophia is has been moved in Hamilton, has lived in Hamilton for the last 8 years, since she moved to Canada. And she moved here 8 years ago to begin work on her PhD at McMaster. She has since gained that PhD, that doctorate, in eco-hydrology, and her specialization is in wetland function and disturbance. She's a member of Hamilton 350 Committee with the Conservation Matters Group, and a keen advocate for climate action. So Sophie, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I think you're going to begin by sharing some of your expertise and then introducing some of our guests.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Dawn. So, hi everyone. My name's Sophie, and as Dawn mentioned, so I'm going to give a quick presentation just now on the value of wetlands, make sure everyone is up to speed on, these really key aspects of what wetlands do for us and for our sort of surrounding ecosystems. And then I'm going to introduce Mike Waddington, who is here today. He's one of our special guest speakers from McMaster. And we also have Martin and maybe Kim. I don't know if I saw her here. Oh, hi. From Conservation Halton. So I'll go ahead with my presentation, and then I'll introduce the other two sets of guest speakers. I'm going to redo it. All of the Zoom troubles tonight. Here we go.
I could see it, but not hear you. Not yet.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but I can't see it.
Oh, you can hear me, but you can't see it.
It was there and it disappeared, Sophie.
Okay. Let me try something else. All right, I think this is the one. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to just briefly talk about the value of wetlands. So what I'm going to start with is actually discussing something that we found really sort of important and interesting in our Conservation Matters meeting the other week, which was to talk about the different types of wetlands. So we know that wetlands also, wetland is a big umbrella term for lots of different ecosystems. And we know that they have this very important role in our environment. But when we talk about wetlands, there's always lots of different names thrown around. So to think about really what is in a name, I'm going to here sort of describe to you how the different names of wetlands actually sort of relate to the differences in their function. And of course, the differences in function result in their differences in the services that they provide to us and the surrounding areas. So here you can see I've listed some sort of common types of wetlands. We have pond, marsh, swamp, fen, and bog. And like I said, you'll see a lot of these names or types of wetlands sort of in the names of wetlands. I know Mike later is going to talk about Beverly Swamp and Fletcher Fens. So there's just two of them. There's also Wainfleet Bog down in the Welland area that I'm sure you're familiar with. So I've put these in this order like this because actually they're ordered in sort of the amount of open water that each of these wetland types have. So ponds, as expected, have the most open water. Marshes tend to have sort of a large proportion of open water, but some areas that have this sort of periodic inundation listed here. Swamps are tricky because they're sometimes hard to identify as wetlands because of this periodic inundation. So they're sort of sometimes very wet and sometimes not so wet. And then we have fens and bogs that are peatlands, and the water table is often under the ground, so you can't see it. So there's just some examples of these different wetlands there. So I thought that was important to bring up. So when we're thinking about the different wetlands that are in and around Hamilton and how they're affected by the OWES change, you can think about them in terms of the specific sort of function and workings of that particular wetland. And what I wanted to point out was that even though wetlands are typically sort of given a specific name, even within a wetland, there's lots and lots of complexity. And that's because wetlands tend to form in these complexes, which is, of course, one of the changes to the policy. So I just borrowed this photo from my colleague, Manuel, and you can see here that actually these different colors all represent different types of wetlands on the landscape. So this is a northern landscape, so you won't be finding this in Hamilton, but I thought it was a very good sort of example of how interspersed these ecosystems are on the landscape. And a little bit closer to home, we in Hamilton see a lot of wetlands that look like this. So here you can see you have this sort of open pond in the middle, and then you have reeds and different sedges around the edge, forming a sort of marsh area, and then you have trees in the back, which may or may not be a swamp. So I just wanted to really show visually what we're talking about when we're talking about these complexes and how diverse wetland ecosystems are. Even if you can draw a circle around it, there's probably lots of different wetland types going on within that. And so now I'm just going to share sort of three major categories of wetland values. So what wetlands sort of bring to us and our surrounding environment. So as lots of us are aware, one of the biggest values of wetlands is their ability to protect us from floods. So because wetlands either have this water table close to the surface or above the surface of the ground, it means they can sort of take in a lot of water and it moderates peak stream flow. So this is really helpful so that sort of small streams and rivers do not get overwhelmed with storm flows. And so I think Kim and Martin will probably be talking more about this later from the very cool study. The next category you can think of is in terms of carbon and climate. So wetlands are very good at absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. This carbon sort of can go into the above ground plants and also sometimes go into peat, which is organic material that gets sort of formed into organic soil in the ecosystems. And that provides really long-term carbon storage. So this is a really key player in climate mitigation in terms of locking that carbon up and keeping it in the ground. Wetlands actually also have been found to cool the atmosphere around them. So just like how having trees on your street can act to sort of cool your neighborhood, having wetlands around can have the same effect. And the last category here, I have borrowed some really wonderful photos from another colleague, Chantel Markle here. And that is to discuss wetland values of habitat. So wetlands are crucial habitat for many species, some rare and endangered flora and fauna, so plants and animals. And these include species at risk like the Massasauga rattlesnake, and especially relevant for Hamilton, the blandings, painted and spotted turtles. Wetlands are also sort of key habitats for lots of migratory birds, different types of amphibians and fish. As Don pointed out earlier, of course, these are sort of federal sort of policy species. And so I just wanted to, make sure we were all on the same page and we understood the sort of different avenues that wetlands bring us value and what they can be sort of evaluated on. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much. And I will introduce our next guest speaker. And that is Mike Waddington, who is a professor at the at McMaster University. And Mike was born and raised in Hamilton, and he has over 30 years of wetland experience and over 20 years of wetland restoration experience. Mike has conducted research previously with Hamilton Conservation under the leadership and guidance of the late Bruce Duncan. And he's worked at several Hamilton wetlands, including the Confederation Park Marshes, the Coketown Bog, the Beverly Swamp, and the Fletcher Creek Preserve Fens. He is also a member of the McMaster Watershed Trust that is working to restore the wetlands on McMaster's West Campus. So with that, I'll introduce Mike. Thank you very much for being here, and excited to see what you have to say.
Thanks, Sophie. People hear me okay? Yeah, it's not a good day, not a good year to be a wetland in Ontario. And Sophie asked me just to share some thoughts for your group. What a wonderful group you have here. Don, I've been involved with a lot of your activism for a long time, in particular through the late Jack Lee with the Red Hill Creek. Really stoked to see my friend Craig Cassar now on Hamilton Council. As Sophie said, I'm born and raised in Hamilton. I actually don't live in Hamilton anymore, but it's still very close to my heart. I'm a Prophet Mac. That's my Twitter handle. But as Sophie said, I've been very lucky to have done a lot of research in many of Hamilton's wetlands. And I think it's really important to give a shout out to the Hamilton Conservation Authority that had the vision to conserve and protect a lot of really critical wetlands. We have all of those main wetland classes and types that Sophie mentioned not in the city of Hamilton, but in the watershed, in particular the upper reaches of the Spencer Creek or the Fletcher Fens over here on the left. I've worked there. I've worked in the Copetown Bog, which is all along the edge of the Hamilton-Brantford Rail Trail, and of course the Beverly Swamp, of which a very large proportion is under the ownership of the Hamilton Conservation Authority, and of course, don't forget the RBG and its role with wetlands such as Coots. Sophie asked me to talk a little bit about Bill 23 and Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. Don's already done an excellent job highlighting where what the bill, the dangers it has for wetlands. Just want to mention though that again, like the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, OWES, works like a report card. When I first started my graduate work, my supervisor was asked to work on critiquing the hydrological component because you're assessed in several classes: biological, social, hydrological, and special features. And I remember us sitting down and looking at it and not really liking this report card. The reason I don't like the report card is that you could be really highly ranked in one category and not be ranked very high overall. I am of the belief that wetlands are where they are for a reason, and all of them should be getting A pluses. So I just want to that caveat that I've never been a fan of the wetland evaluation system because I think a lot of really important critical functions are being missed because of this overall lumping into the categories. But nevertheless, it's what we have. It's being greatly reduced in its power, as Don very well mentioned. One of the biggest concerns I have is the actual who's doing the evaluations. I was introduced to the world of environmental consultancy through one of my former supervisors' partners, and they had a contract with a very big Canadian company who reached out to them and says, "I don't care if your numbers are credible as long as they're shreddable." And if the evaluation system gets into the hands of consultants or which are linked strongly to developers, there are lots of ways that you could do an evaluation not to give it its true score. In particular, as Sophie mentioned, wetlands are not always wet. Some are seasonally wet, and that's a critical, important function. If a wetland is not wet and you get a major rainstorm, it can store more water. So its ability to mitigate floods varies seasonally. And so in the very brief time I've spent watching Hamilton Conservation Authority meetings, the one on the Garner Marsh, I think it was last year, really frustrated me about some of the positions that were being made by the consultants that had been hired by the company. So that concerns me. Who's going to do it, and the lack of expertise at the municipal level. I'm hopeful that our politicians in particular, our fantastic new councillors in the city will reach out to those who do have the expertise if they do need some expert opinion. Wetland complexes are gone. Species at risk are no longer in the special features category. So these are quite concerned. I just want to talk a little bit more about the wetland complexes. So right now, pieces of a large interconnected wetland are not evaluated in isolation. They're done as an integrated whole, very much like a body which has different functions and organs that provide really important roles to the overall health of our body. Wetlands kind of work in the same way. They all play different roles. They have various amounts of wetness and connectivity, and at different times they have they can build in a lot of redundancy and resilience to withstand disturbance. We know that wetland complexes are connected. We know that from the science. They're connected by groundwater. They're connected by surface water at certain times of the year. That should say reptile. I don't know what a reptile is, but they move from patches to patches. And by getting rid of the complex aspect, each of these individual wetlands will be evaluated in isolation, and as a result, will result in a lower grade and reduce their potential for being protected. So this is straight from the wetland evaluation system, this figure here, to give an example. So if a wetland in a complex is more than 750 meters, I don't know what the scientific relevance of 750 meters is. It's actually just sort of seems to be picked out of a hat, because in some situations, 750 is way too high, and in some places, 750 is way too small, depending on the landscape that you're in. But all those wetlands 1 through 7 would be a complex, but under the new rules would be evaluated individually, even though they may, in many cases often do, play a role together. In your upper left photo is an aerial shot of the Fletcher, I call them the Fletcher Fens. They're in Puslinch County. They are in the headwaters of the Spencer Creek, so they're under the Hamilton Conservation Authority. This is in the Fletcher Creek Preserve. Together with some professors at University of Toronto, we helped restore the old quarry that was on the HCA property into supposed to be into a fen. It's slowly getting there. But I want to zoom in on this a little bit. You see my arrow? Okay, someone, maybe Don, if you could nod. Okay. Off to the left is the Galt Moraine. A lot of groundwater is pouring off of this moraine, and water used to flow from left to right, except they put a railway through the middle of it. As a result, this big wetland complex, or big wetland, is actually broken into small intermediate ones. You've got one upstream of the railway. We've got the main fen here. We've got another fen over there, and then it's one we call Timbit because it looks like a Timbit. They are all separate wetlands, but in many cases they are broken apart by a cedar forest, which is not classified as a wetland. And as a result, while these are under the protection of the HCA currently, we could imagine that these would be evaluated separately, even though part of the reason why they are separate is because there was a disturbance that was put into place. And the reason I wanted to show this is we can think a little bit about what were to happen if one of these other wetlands would not be evaluated highly, would be developed, that it could put extra pressures on the remaining wetlands, which could potentially lower its score in the future. I believe that was used as an argument about Garner Marsh, is that it was not that good a quality wetland. If you degrade the landscape, the wetland long enough, it might not serve its original function, which I think is a pretty weak argument. So this is just another image of it. This is the Galt Moraine. These are all those wetlands now oriented north. And there's that railway that cuts through there, and those are all those separate wetlands. So we did a lot of research there. This is again back when the late Bruce Duncan was the head of the HCA. I miss him dearly, but he really pushed for the need for research on wetlands on the lands that the HCA owns. So we've done a lot of work to show about the variation in species richness, species diversity between these different wetlands within this complex. And so it worries me greatly that this component of the wetland evaluation system has been removed. And so the arguments that Dawn has said earlier, we really advocate for. The only additional group that I would argue that we should be potentially reaching out to, ironically, are insurance companies. A lot of my research, I work with the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is based out of Western. And insurance companies will know the knock-on effects if you remove wetlands upstream or in the headwaters of a watershed, the potential for downstream flooding. And of course, insurance costs will be greatly varied. I just wanted to finish off with this sort of work we've done in Beverly Swamp. Beverly Swamp is an amazing wetland. It's had a lot of different impacts, but I also want to show that it has two main streams that go through it. Fletcher, which is downstream from that previous wetland I showed you. And actually Fletcher is the bigger stream in the headwaters of the Spencer Creek than Spencer, which is downstream of the Wetlands Reservoir. Spencer, and what's really important is that this is a complex in of itself. There are a lot of different wetland types of different variations of swamps within the Beverly Swamp itself. And while a lot of it is protected, it's not all protected, and HCA has a really good management plan for it. But what's really interesting is in the northwestern component, there's actually no stream. The water flows connecting through little rivulets. And it's not uncommon after a very dry summer when they do open up the Wetlands Reservoir in the fall, is that the water is completely absorbed before it gets to the confluence of these two streams. The role then that this reservoir plays and then the reservoir after it is really quite important for downstream flooding, of course, upstream, of course, of the Christie Dam. So we're very lucky that we have these wetlands protected in the headwaters of the Spencer. We do not have the large amount of protection in the upper street reaches of the Ancaster Creek, and I'm sure you're all aware of the wonderful job that Craig did on that video. I've watched it several times, Craig, and I really love your passion for the Hamilton area. I'm really, again, happy that you're Ancaster councillor. So yeah, I just wanted to finish with this here, just to show these are different categories of different wetlands within the Beverly Swamp. Here is the inflow along the Fletcher, and it functions very differently than other portions. So it's really important that we realize that wetlands are complex, they're awesome, but that we are downloading a lot of responsibility onto municipalities that may not have that expertise, and the consequences of that are quite large. So I think that's kind of what you want me to talk a little bit about, Sophie, so I'll just end there.
That was great. Thank you very much. It was great to see those maps and photos of the local wetlands particularly. So now we will move on to our final speakers, Kim and Martin, and then what we'll do is have a quick minute for any of the sort of guest speakers or speakers from today to ask each other a question, and we'll also be taking questions through the chat. So after Kim and Martin have spoken, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. And then just so everyone is sort of up to speed, in terms of our call to action, which is contacting your MPs and also contacting the conservation authorities to ask them to take this to the federal level. We're going to be sending out materials on who to email and potentially some bullet points in an email to everyone who has registered for this webinar. So you will be getting those. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Kim Barrett and Martin. Sorry, Martin, I've lost your last name. From Conservation Houghton. they were involved in a really, really amazing study where the value of wetlands in the Grindstone Creek area were sort of financially valued, and this research got a lot of press, and rightly so, I think. So hopefully we're going to find out quite a lot more about it right now.
Very good. Thank you, Sophie. So I'm going to start off, and we're going to hand it over to Kim. We're going to do this the two of us. So first of all, thank you for inviting us. So I'm Martin Keller. I'm the Senior Manager, Watershed Planning and Source Protection with Conservation Halton, and I'm really happy to be here. Happy to see some familiar faces and names in the kind of chat. So absolutely delighted to be here. So yes, I'm going to just start sharing my screen here. Just a second. There we go. Can you see that? Okay, excellent.
Yes.
So wonderful to be speaking after Sophie. You had a great kind of introduction to, and we're speaking about, you know, the different values of wetlands in terms of flood protection, carbon storage, and habitat. And Mike too, I really appreciated your insights. And so I'm going to speak about a little bit like in terms of wetlands as natural assets from a little bit of a different perspective, really into context of that asset management. And let me see how I go down. Here we go. Okay. So I obviously don't need to tell you how, you know, important wetlands are. We've just heard it, and you obviously already are interested in this. But it's also from this natural asset perspective, it's really one of the most vital assets, if I want to put it that way. And as we look at it in terms of our overall infrastructure systems, we actually rely on those ecosystems to provide us with services. And one of them, as was mentioned before, in terms of, you know, wetland, mitigate potential downstream flood impacts. There's lots of other values, but this is the one that we really specifically focused on in terms of our study on the Grindstone Creek. So I want to talk about wetlands as natural assets, but before I go there, I wanted to just turn a little bit to some of the terminology that we've used. We talked about natural assets now. I'm sure you heard about green infrastructure. You may have heard about nature-based solutions, low impact development, and this kind of shows you a little bit how it all fits together. And of course, things can be divvied up in different ways, and at the end of the day, it may not actually matter too much what is what. But really, what for me, one of the takeaway is that we can't really rely on, as maybe traditionally we have, on just one set of those, you know, specifically gray infrastructure in terms of our services. We really need to look at the whole range of assets that we have, from natural to enhanced, you know, for example, rain gardens and bioswales and so forth, to the engineered in terms of rain barrels, permeable, paval, and so forth. So the whole range of what we have, we need to figure out how to look at those holistically and as a whole. So moving on to the actual Grindstone Creek project, just a little bit of context for where we are. If you look at the map here, you see at the bottom right is the city of Hamilton. You see the Hamilton Harbor and Coots in blue. You see the 403. I'm not sure whether you see my cursor here, but you see the 403 going through here, and then Highway 6 goes all the way up north towards Guelph. Grindstone Creek watershed is a very unique, kind of interesting watershed. It's a total of 91 square kilometers. It forms in the headwaters of Hayland Swamp, so right up in the headlands there. And it's bisected by the escarpment. So Waterdown is here, and this is kind of where the escarpment goes across it. And so it has very significant natural features, including wetlands and rumlands, karst topography, creek valleys, estuary marshes down towards Hidden Valley, where the creek comes out of through RBG and then drains into the harbor. So it really is quite unique also in the terms of that it's very different from what is happening up on the escarpment versus below. In total, there's about 93% of the land uses in the upper reaches include rural, residential, and agricultural and open spaces. So it's not very, as most of you will know, it's very rural, not much development. And so it's only 7% urbanized in Hamilton and Burlington. But if you look at only the lower portions below the escarpment, that percentage raises up to, it's 40% of land use is urbanized below the escarpment. In total, we have about 14% wetlands and 31% is forested. And the proportion of that is actually falling into the Carolinean forest zone as well. So it's very unique. So what did we want to do? The purpose of the study was really to identify, understand, and I've got this on the screen here, I'll just read it off, and quantify the roles of those natural assets. We're talking about the forests and the wetlands and so forth, as a component of the services. Again, flood mitigation, stormwater management, and obviously also water quality control. And we wanted to look at the specific cost and benefits of those natural assets. Providing these services in comparison to what it would mean if you had to actually engineer those alternatives in terms of operation, management, operations and maintenance, and just establishing them. So of course, you have diversion channels, you have stormwater management ponds. Those are all engineered solutions to kind of mimic and what traditionally or before would have been provided for by natural assets. Now, we didn't do the study on our own. That this was a very collaborative study. We worked very closely together with the cities, both Burlington and Hamilton, Royal Botanical Gardens, and we also got funding from the Greenbelt Foundation. And the work was led by the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, MNAI. So very much a collaborative effort. And I should also mention that I've only joined Conservation Halton a little while ago, last year, so I can't take credit of any other work here, but I'm really excited to be part of this now and moving forward. Moving on to study findings. So that's what Sophie mentioned before. Natural assets, 2 billion. That was what the headlines, garnered really attention in the media, and that's for stormwater management alone. So what it really means is if we had to, if the wetlands, if the forests, if those natural assets weren't providing the services, and we would have to build, replace those services with engineered infrastructure, it would cost 2 billion. That's just for establishing those. That doesn't count the annual maintenance and operational costs that great infrastructure would obviously come with. Beside that, there's also annual benefits that those natural assets are providing, and here's the figure here is 34 million. Other benefits such as erosion control, carbon storage, recreation. So those are the two kind of monetary value, the results from the study. But there's other things too that the study really key findings of the study. One of them obviously is really data. You can't do those studies without, and specifically the quantification of those studies, of those services, you can't do without a robust watershed assessment. And you need consistent, well-managed data to do that. And luckily, we were able to do that, and we had that together with our partners to pull everything together. Now, the other aspect, and you will also be very well aware of that, is the natural assets that don't respect political boundaries. So it really is important that we collaborate amongst all the different agencies, municipalities, conservation authorities, in this case RBG and others, to really come together and do those things. It needs to do it at a watershed scale. That's the best option to go forward with. So there's key recommendations coming out of the study as well, and I want to focus on 3 of them specifically. First of all, we obviously want to take this a step further and really develop a collaborative watershed management strategy and a plan for the Gwinesdale Creek watershed. So that's the first step. Obviously, over time and in the years to come, what we'd like to do is also expand and into the other watersheds of Conservation Halton. Going east, we have 16 miles in Bronte, and actually Bronte and then 16 miles. But so this is our core project right now, but we want to establish it beyond this watershed. But Now, again, in terms of the data that we spoke about before, we can only manage what we measure. So it really is important to have a robust collaborative monitoring plan that we're going to continue to enhance and build upon. And then obviously as well, something that Conservation Halton is doing already a lot of, but again, through this project, really having the means to figure out where those key and high-risk areas are so we can further the restoration of those wetlands and other natural assets. We're going to share the slide deck later on with you as well, and I've got a couple of links there as well for the summary report and full report that is accessible on our Conservation Halton website. So you'll be able to see and look at the study in more detail as well. So that's it for that aspect, and I'm going to hand it over to Kim to talk about the wetlands specifically as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Martin. Oh, a bit of an echo there. Is that better? Okay. So hi, everybody. My name's Kim Barrett, and I'm the Associate Director of Science and Partnerships with Conservation Halton. Very happy to be here tonight. I've been with CH for about 20 years. I'm an ecologist by training, and my work now focuses on monitoring and ecological restoration. So you may hear me refer to Conservation Halton as CH throughout the presentation just by force of habit and because it's easier to say. So yeah, my part of the talk is going to focus really on kind of the regulatory implications on CH as a conservation authority in relation to the changes to the wetland evaluation system that have come about recently. So this is a map of Conservation Halton's watershed outlined in pink. The dark area at the kind of bottom right is Lake Ontario. Grindstone Creek it's cut off a little bit, but it's right at the bottom center of the watershed. So that's the area that Martin was just talking about. And our watershed encompasses all of Burlington, parts of Hamilton, Oakville, Milton, Halton Hills, and tiny little slivers of Mississauga to the east and Puslich up to the northwest. And if you look, it's almost a vertical line in the middle of the screen off to the left a little bit, but that dark ribbon in the middle is an agro escarpment. And the bright green blobs on this map are wetlands. And you can see that the vast majority of wetlands are located above the Niagara Escarpment. And in the urban centers, especially, Burlington, Oakville, Milton, there's very few wetlands remaining, and someone made a reference earlier to about 70% wetland loss, and that's certainly the case in our watershed from historical levels as well. And if you ever want to have a look at this mapping, the address for our website is in the lower right there. Okay, next slide, please, Martin. Thank you. So Conservation Halton and other conservation authorities regulate development that's proposed in or adjacent to wetlands. And an important note is that we regulate all wetlands regardless of their provincial status. The map that I just showed you we use it as a screening tool to identify the best information that we have on wetland locations, but we always prefer to go out and ground truth them where we can. So where the provincial status comes into play in terms of our regulation is in defining the extent of the regulated area around the wetland. So for wetlands that are provincially significant or 2 hectares in size or larger, we regulate the area within 120 meters of the wetland boundary. For wetlands that are smaller than 2 hectares, we only regulate the area within 30 meters around the area, around the boundary of the wetland. And it's important to realize that this regulated area is not a no-touch zone. It just identifies the area within which any proposed development needs to come to CH for review and approval. And just one final note on CH wetlands before I shift to the provincial changes is that almost all of the provincially significant wetlands within Conservation Halton's jurisdiction are complexes, about 95% of them. And this has been alluded to already as well, that this becomes a relevant factor when we talk about changes to the wetland evaluation system. Okay, so we call it OIS for short. But one thing that you haven't heard me mention so far is the role of conservation authorities in designating wetlands as provincially significant. And that's because we actually have never had that responsibility, and we still don't. So prior to December 2022, and for the first 30 plus years of its existence, that role has been with the Ministry of Natural Resources. So conservation authorities have never had jurisdiction or responsibility for designating which wetlands are provincially significant. We get that information from the province, and then we apply that to inform our regulatory limits. So I'm going to dig a little deeper into the weeds of what the wetland evaluation system is. So it's a science-based system. There's two manuals, one for the north, one for the south. They're each about 250 pages. And it outlines a process and criteria that identify and assess the functions of wetlands in Ontario. And as Mike was saying, it's based on a scoring system that has these four broad areas of consideration: biological, hydrological, social, and special features. So the maximum point total for each of these areas is 250. So the maximum total score is 1,000. So 250 for each of those four components. And wetlands are provincially significant if they score a total of 600 or more points out of 1,000, or if they score 200 or more points in either the biological component or the special features component. And yeah, I agree. There's an argument to be made that maybe they should be provincially significant if they score 200 or more in the hydrological component or the social component. It's a bit of a values thing there. So, okay, next slide, please. So back in October 2022, the MNRF proposed updates to the system. And one of the most significant changes was certainly this proposed different approach to the formal approval of wetland evaluations. And I'll cover that in a bit more detail on my next slide. And the other, of course, was the complete removal of the section in the manual about wetland complexing. Sophie talked about how important wetland complexes are, how wetland, individual units function together. And with the changes that have come about now, individual components can be evaluated and scored independently of one another. You'll recall I mentioned this, that a score of 200 or more points in special features means that you're a provincially significant wetland. So in the previous versions of the manual, there were two distinctions. So reproductive habitat of an endangered or threatened species scored 250 in the special features component. So if you had reproductive habitat for an endangered threatened species, you were automatically a provincially significant wetland. There was kind of a secondary category for migration, feeding, and hibernation habitat for endangered and threatened species. And if you had any of those examples, you would score 150 for the first species and then 75 for any additional species. So not automatically a PSW, but a good start. So these two sections have been removed completely from the manual. And in the new version, you can still score endangered species if they're also considered, and this is getting really into the nerdy weeds, but you can score them if they're also considered provincially, regionally, or locally significant, but the score is a lot lower. So that score starts at 50 points and it goes down from there. So it's not as high of a score as the previous scores were available for threatened and endangered species. And just one final change I'd like to highlight that was of particular interest to CH was in the introduction. The previous version included several paragraphs describing various ways that wetland evaluations are useful for supporting a variety of different conservation authority activities like administering our regulation, undertaking watershed planning. And we haven't been explicitly prohibited from using wetland evaluations for those purposes, but those paragraphs have been removed from the document. Okay, now this is my second last slide, and it goes into the details of the approvals process. Because the take-home story from this slide is that what was proposed isn't actually what happened if you go into the manual. So the column on the far left is an excerpt from the 2013 Southern Ontario Wetland Evaluation System Manual. So this is the version that was in place before December of last year. And you can see from the highlighted section at the bottom that there was a defined process, a defined approval process that really clearly identified the need for review and sign off by MNR staff. Now moving over to the middle column ERO posting, that is text from the environmental registry posting that outlined the proposed changes to the manual. So we all saw this posted and thought that that's the way that that things were going to go. And essentially all of the text from the first column was proposed for removal. And in its place, they substituted a new section called a complete application that doesn't specifically reference approval, but it speaks to a decision maker who would determine whether the evaluation was complete. But if you go to the far right column and read what actually came about in the manual, essentially the evaluation is considered complete and final once a trained wetland evaluator attests that they have undertaken an evaluation in accordance with OS. And what this translates to is that there's no longer any peer review by anyone of the process. And one of the other things that really struck me as I was reviewing the document is that there are many, many fewer references to MNR providing support, technical support to evaluators during the wetland evaluation process. Those references have been almost removed from the document. Okay, and I think we're on our last slide now. Okay, so the title of this webinar was Protecting Our Wetlands, What Can We Do? So Martin and I wanted to end with a slide that addresses this question specifically. So the first information or recommendation is to be informed. And you know, everyone has taken a step in that direction just by attending this session. So kudos to all of you. And as you can probably tell from my presentation, especially there's a lot of technical information and jargon to wade through, but it's really critical to have accurate and up-to-date information. And you know, speaking of jargon, natural assets, I know we used to just call them forests and wetlands or nature for short, but you know, recognizing and naming the value that nature provides from an economic and a social perspective can be a really effective way of shifting perspectives of people who may not really spend much time thinking about the environment. So I always think about it as a way of, you know, bringing more people into the tent to join the cause, even though they may join the cause for different reasons. So, you know, talk to others about natural assets, spread the word about why they're important, how they're relevant to everyone, to all people. And finally, I just would advise you to watch the environmental registry for future postings. And if you're concerned about something that's already taken place, like the changes to the wetland evaluation system, and this has come up already, just share what you know with your elected officials. And I think that is it for us. Great.
Focused on the Garner Marsh efforts. So that website is one, and she's put a link in the chat, and we'll be including it in the package we send out. Is a good source for additional information. So Nancy?
Well, you just covered it. Thanks, Dawn. I was just going to say, I know that we're sending an email out, but if you're super eager and pissed off right now, and you want to just go copy and paste a bunch of emails, then please head over to Save Our Streams, where you can easily do that. And thanks to Sue and Marie for helping for drafting the little blurb to get you all started with some things that you want to say. And I know that Justin Trudeau wasn't really on the list of people that we were supposed to add onto our list, but I added him anyway because he needs to know too. Thanks, everybody.
So just going back and reiterating, there's a lot of information that we've gotten tonight. We've had great speakers who've gone into detail on the issues of wetlands and the values of wetlands and how they're evaluated and so on. I think we've all learned a lot. I certainly have. And I hope that this has been a helpful webinar that you will recommend to others, perhaps come back to visit if you want to see some of this again, and that you will take seriously the proposal that we're making from Hamilton 350 that the federal government needs to be involved, and we need to do what we can to try to convince the federal government to be involved. And we're suggesting writing to MPs. We're suggesting, I think Nancy's correct, that we should be writing to the Prime Minister and the leaders of the opposition parties, and we'll include those addresses in the package we send out, and urging the conservation authorities who are particularly impacted by some of these changes that those boards should be considering doing the same and writing to and encouraging the federal government to get much more deeply involved in this situation that we've been confronted with in Ontario, where it seems difficult to get a message through to the provincial government that they actually listen to or respond to. So we need other ways of doing that. Municipal councils are taking some steps in these directions, if you're following that. And the federal government, some officials in the federal government have already spoken about this. So we just want to accelerate that process if we can, as another way of trying to protect what we have, enhance what we have, ensure that the desecration of nature and natural areas is reversed. I think that is shared by probably most of the people who have joined the webinar tonight. So let me thank you all for being here. Like I say, we will send out information to all of you and others who registered and weren't able to get in. I think maybe some people got excluded because when we were running into the problem of the Zoom bombing, we were being very cautious about who was actually added to the list of people attending. That seems to have worked in the sense that the Zoom bombing ended, but it may have excluded some quite innocent folks from being able to participate with us tonight. So thank you very much. And thank you in particular to Martin and Kim and Mike and Sophie. I keep calling you Sophia, sorry. I think it's been wonderful to have this kind of expertise shared, and we hope to do more webinars, continue to try to play a role in our community in defense of conservation and in defense of the critical role that natural features play in climate mitigation and climate adaptation as well. So this is pretty central to what we do in Hamilton 350, at least in the Conservation Matters section of the Hamilton 350 Committee. So thank you all tonight, and we will wrap it up.